All right, here we are, KIN214, and we are talking small apparatus. Now, small apparatus is a term that can be used to talk about any type of equipment that's outside of the norm or the regular that you see in more traditional lifting. So like more traditionally, you might think of like barbell, trap bar, perhaps dumbbells. And small apparatus is any number of different things that you can use to maybe increase a degree of difficulty or decrease a degree of difficulty. Think of it in terms of like progression, regression. So we're actually talking about a way to combine different modalities to create some uniquely challenging exercises. But it requires a thought process to be successful, right? You just can't have your person come in and expect them to be able to function and do a particular exercise. So you have to be able to layer in these different challenges. So if you look at this from a traditional standpoint, we have more traditional exercise like a dumbbell bench press, and your client goes ahead and they work out and they end up increasing the weight that they can push around. Meanwhile, what you're doing is you're teaching your client how to even transition and get on a piece of small modality equipment like a physio ball. So for example, you have the introduction. Here's the physio ball. Here's how you sit on a physio ball. Here's how you roll down on a physio ball to get into a position. Perhaps you're mimicking laying on a bench like you're doing a dumbbell bench press, or you actually have them start doing exercises in a supine position like you see here, a crunch. So let's just take a look here. Pretty straightforward on a dumbbell bench press. And so it's important to note that getting into this position here requires a transition from, first of all, standing to seated on the ball, which is a teaching point for you with your client, and then transitioning from seated to lying flat and feeling comfortable to being in that position. And lying flat in that position might require you to do like some core work with your client to get them nice and strong to be able to do what is the next evolution of these two together. So let's let this play out here. And that next evolution, when you look at this, if we kind of shrink down what we were just talking about, traditional small modality, we have a dumbbell bench press with the crunch, and then we ask the person to do a dumbbell bench press lying on a ball. So notice. So you notice on that there's a transition. In essence, this person was seated upright and they had to transition to laying flat. That's a teachable point or a teachable moment for you with your clients. Let's kind of let that play again so you can see that happen. Going from a seated position to laying flat, going past what would be normally crunch to where the shoulder blades are pretty much on North Pole, maybe a little bit further south, but it's supporting the shoulder girdle as well as the neck. Let's take a look. And it's just important to note that you have to introduce like the structural stuff first. You have point of contact here, point of contact on the feet, and this is all vulnerable at this point. So you have to have these moments and these teachable moments when you're working with your client to get them first to understand, to get stronger here, and then be able to transition here, and then be able to then come down here. But notice, we've introduced in a physio ball to do dumbbell bench press. Here the person is doing 50 pounders. Here this is closer to like 30 pounders. So we've progressed in one area, balance and instability, but we've regressed in another weight. And I think this is an important bullet point. When we start to introduce in, let me pause the strap up here. When you introduce in these different pieces of equipment, understand that there's going to be progression, regression on here. Whether it's an Airx foam mat, which is many times used just for cushioning, but also its instability purposes come to play. Half foam roller is great because you have flat on one side and it's rounded or crowned on the other side. So depending which side you have up is going to matter in terms of how that feels. These are called sand bells, where you can throw these guys and the ballast in here moves around much like a tidal tank. Same thing with a tidal tank. You fill it with water to your discretion in terms of how much water you want in there. But every time you move around, it sloshes the water around, which causes an adaptation. Kettlebells, different things you can do because the handle is not in center mass of the kettlebell itself. You can do bottoms up type movement patterns to work on instability. I like this 3D strap exercise, which is called Strap 3D. If we just go ahead and scroll this out, you'll notice we're talking about coiling type exercises or rotational exercises. The strap goes around the shoulder, around the torso, around the hip, and it attaches to a cable crossover piece of equipment. So it offers resistance in any number of different planes and vectors, but in a rotational manner. So I like this, and this might be one where you go ahead and take a look at this video. You can look at like, hip drive and split squats and different things to work on. And it's a wonderful tool that you can use to be able to integrate in rotational force and torque across the knee and torque across the hip joint. I'm going to go ahead and move on from that. All right, so in class, we've already had the pleasure of working and throwing around medicine balls. We've stood on BOSUs. You've seen the wobble boards in the corner. We've also worked with bands, and there's different types of bands and different bands of different thickness, and it's color codified, like spry tubing out of Libertyville. You'll have different colors will denote different types of resistance. So if we look at ways to progress this, like we thought about earlier, you have a kneeling wood chop, kneeling crossbody wood chop, kneeling crossbody dynamic wood chop. This is a progression from very simple to more complex. A single plane exercise here, very sagittal plane, to a crossbody multiplanular movement. So going from outside of the left knee up over the right shoulder to where we make this more ballistic, to where you have an increase in the power production because you're actually throwing the ball. So it's a good example of how you can use a medicine ball, even in the context of a progression on a much bigger picture, to take something from very simple single plane movement now to a more complex dynamic movement cross body, to even make it more ballistic in terms of throwing a medicine ball. The step that you would have before this is you might teach every one of these in a standing position instead of a kneeling position, so they have more muscle and more coordination involved in the process, because we're more accustomed to standing movement patterns than kneeling. But the point is, when you go to a kneeling position, you take away some of the musculature that helps you to balance and stabilize. So there's a progression here, and you're seeing a small snippet of that progression. And where this becomes even a step further is where the person is thrown the medicine ball, it bounces on the floor, the person catches it, goes right into a crossbody movement pattern and snaps the ball back down to a partner, and they're constantly throwing the ball back and forth instead of bouncing it on the wall, which makes it more dynamic yet again. Let's get these guys out of here. TRX is a small apparatus that we've already used in class, but you can see something as simple as a push-up or a row in terms of how you can use that. Pretty straightforward for both of those. Position matters, location matters. When we talk about exercise bands, here's a real simple one done in a frontal plane where we're stomped down on the band and you can see the resistance being offered. We know rubber bands offer more resistance the further you stretch them. So here we have side raise for delt. We got a bilateral thing going on. I would actually do maybe one set on one foot, one set on the other foot, just to be able to counterbalance any issues you might have where one band gets a little more stretched than the other, how minute. Over here, we have a 1 foot hip rotation with band. I like this for working on torque across the knee as well as torque across the hip. And you can see where the resistance is being offered laterally. It's in transverse plane. So before you would even load in this situation, you would work on this movement pattern first and then offer loading to the person. So you wouldn't even throw them right in right away. You would go ahead and do the movement pattern first, then offer loading. And matter of fact, maybe even have them stand on 1 foot and you stretch the band first, and then you have the person do the movement. So there's ways that you can do this, but it's limitless, and you're kind of limited only by your own creativity. And you just have to be cautious though, because oftentimes you'll see newer trainers, they turn like exercises into like a carnival ride. It's just silly. And you don't want to put yourself or put your client in a position where they're at peril because you're getting overly creative. I will say this though, with some of the exercises that you can do, as long as you teach the progressions correctly, and maybe you teach them like 2 different paths like I showed earlier, and then you merge them together into another exercise you have to be determined down the road. That's a very easy way to teach skills, movement skills on the front end. And then once they get into a particular movement pattern that may seem new to that person, it's not really new to their body, because their body be familiar with laying back on a medicine ball. Their body be familiar with pushing dumbbells. Their body's familiar with transitioning from a seated upright position to laying flat on a ball. So all you have to do is just think of this in terms of progression and how you can introduce in these skills and not just throw your person in cold. So with this, in our in-person hands-on, will be assigned a body part and a movement pattern that'll be mostly associated with a more traditional exercise. And you need to come up with a version. And you have to come up with a version that's going to use some type of small apparatus. So, all right, guys, I got about 10 minutes in. I'm signing off.